Hello everybody, my name is Rick Sperling and I'd like to welcome you to a two-part video series where we cover culturally responsive evaluation concepts as we practice them here at the Office of Community-Based Research at St. Mary's University. The purpose of the videos is to really give you an idea of what our office does, the approach that we take, the services that we provide, and also as a secondary purpose to also perhaps stimulate some thought on how evaluation can be carried out and used to build a culture that will create continuous flows of information for you as an organization, while also potentially positioning you better in order to bring in external funding. In this first video, we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves and the services we provide, as well as how the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation Assessment at the University of Illinois has influenced us. And then we're also going to cover some basic concepts having to do with the evaluation process. In the second video, we're actually going to go through some of a little bit of the qualitative, but more of the quantitative approaches to gathering data, analyzing the results, and then how to really make use of those at your organization, some tips. So welcome to this video series, this two-part series. I hope that it proves to be worthwhile. We certainly have had a lot of fun in making them. And so without further ado, I would then like to tell you a little bit about myself and my role here in CBR. My academic training first started actually at the University of Michigan and in Ann Arbor. And my degree is actually in psychology, but I would say for our present purposes, perhaps the most impactful moments came from engaging in service learning. I worked in a couple different sites, and it really introduced me to this idea of connecting academic scholarship with work in the actual community. I thought the design there was pretty good. I felt as though we were making some contributions. But I really didn't fully understand how to know about capturing how that impact was actually playing out, right? So to feel good about something versus to have some tangible evidence to suggest that something you were doing was having that impact, that was all still kind of like a foreign concept to me. After being at Michigan, I actually took a year before my master's program where I was in City or San Antonio. I worked at an elementary school helping those students be able to do better with their reading. And to me, it was kind of an interesting experience and very powerful because I was an outsider. I'd never been to San Antonio before, and the area where I was working, I didn't really share a whole lot in terms of cultural background. And so, I felt again like I was making an impact, but I think that this idea of taking a lot of credit for that impact began to surface for me as being problematic. I remember at the end of the year, some of my fellow Corps members, because it's what we AmeriCorps, so your colleagues were Corps members, were elated that not only that the kids were doing better in the reading, but that we were principally responsible for these kids doing better with their reading. And I remember people getting very upset with me because I said, I hope so. I hope that's true. I don't have any evidence to suggest that that's not true. But there were a lot of other things going on, to include but not limited to just a regression to the mean. And so, it didn't occur to me at that time, but what I was really asking for was a more systematic program evaluation of what was going on with our city or activities at this school. And again, not to try to rain on anyone's parade, but also to not pat ourselves on the back too much when we didn't really know if we were the ones that were having that kind of an impact. After City Year, I went to Arizona State, where I was also involved in service learning, and some of those same tendencies towards credit taking for different kinds of community impact were present there as well. So although my degree was in counselor education, and I think that certainly influences the way that I look at evaluation, those service learning times were very formative for me. And so I worked with the staff there, and they actually did allow me to come up with some ideas about analyzing journals and introducing quantitative metrics and these kinds of things to help get a better understanding of exactly how participation in service learning was affecting the Arizona State students as well as the community members with whom they were working. So that was kind of like the first more organized thinking about program evaluation, even if that language had not yet occurred to me. After Arizona State, I continued with my academic training at the University of Texas at Austin, and my PhD is actually in educational psychology, and my areas of emphases were quantitative methods and human growth and development. And along the way, I also picked up a portfolio specialization in Mexican American studies. Through all of that, which seems like a very diverse array of areas, right, of inquiry, what came from that is my desire to integrate the quantitative methods with the Chicano studies. And so if you look now at the work that we do out of the community-based research, that's really what we have, is an integration of the quantitative methods with the Chicano studies. And I think that helps inform us better on doing what would otherwise be traditional evaluation. And truth be told, St. Mary's was not my first full-time teaching gig. I actually taught at New Mexico State University Carlsbad before coming to St. Mary's. Now, I think that there is a lesson to be learned here for those prospective evaluators out there, or really for many different types of humanities and social science students, and that's that St. Mary's had emerged as probably the target school at which to work because of my city or San Antonio experiences. And so when the job opened up here in San Antonio at St. Mary's, I knew that I had to apply. And I can say fairly confidently that based on the job announcement and feedback that I've received since coming to St. Mary's, the reason that I was hired is because of my background and facility with statistics. And so there's a certain level of job security that comes along with having these sorts of skills, right? And so in terms of academic training, that's something to consider, even if people are not regularly drawn to math. That's what we hear a lot, is I don't like math. So anyway, my actual location officially is in the Department of Psychology. And through the psychology department, we do research, we do service. So one area that I thought I could make become fairly interesting for myself and useful for others was working with a particular nonprofit that works with parent education. And so we got a small grant from the American Educational Research Association and started doing what later became community-based research. But that was just on our own, a few graduate students from the Industrial Organizational Psychology program that we have on campus, and some undergraduate students in psychology. After about a year or two of doing that, our university was actually fortunate enough to get a large federal grant, Title V grant, that had funding for community-based research. And so we were able to grow the size of the staff and the number of organizations with whom we were working, and be able to pay some of these folks to do this, and to even do at one point a series of workshops that were a little bit more elaborated than these videos for the San Antonio Area Foundation. So I think we counted them up not too long ago, and we've got to be approaching about 40 different organizations that we've helped in some capacity with their evaluation and or grant writing needs. The services that we provide, we would say that we go all the way from what we refer to as the dry erase board exercise, which is basically just helping nonprofits think through what evaluation means to them, how to create a culture within the organization of evaluation, and all the way through to more complete, full evaluations for those who are requesting those kinds of services. Our desire, though, is not just simply to be hired in to do full evaluations, but rather to build the capacity at the nonprofit so that the evaluation becomes just a regular part of the operating procedure. Now, another thing to know is that the services that are provided are largely driven by students, undergraduate and sometimes graduate students. And this is because we have academic certificates in community-based assessment and evaluation. So the undergraduate students can earn the certificate along with their major by taking courses in Intro to Statistics, Advanced Statistics, Test and Measurement, Grant Writing, and then they do an internship that we call Applied Program Evaluation. At the graduate level, the students take a similar series, obviously at more advanced levels. They take Advanced Statistics, either multivariate statistics or qualitative methods, a race, class, and gender course, and then also grant writing and the applied evaluation course. So those are the folks that are going to be mainly working with nonprofits who come to us for services. And of course, I would provide the supervision and be able to answer their questions and also meet with the community stakeholders to make sure that everything that's expected and agreed upon up front comes to fruition in a valid and trustworthy manner. The theoretical model that we rely on to guide our evaluation here in the Office of Community-Based Research comes from the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation Assessment at the University of Illinois, headed up by Dr. Stafford Hood. And I just want to take a few minutes here to really go through some aspects of that perspective that we take very seriously. Now, my goal isn't to do justice to the entire Korea perspective. That's not something that we could possibly do in this single video or even across the two videos. But there are certain things that I really want to emphasize that everybody has some basic understanding of how we see the evaluation process. So the first thing is to really come to terms with the fact that evaluation can be threatening and is oftentimes dangerous, right? So a lot of times folks within organizations are anxious about doing evaluation, particularly when they're not in the highest levels of power. The idea being that if the evaluation comes back with less than favorable results, then maybe there's a cut either to a program or to the actual position, or there's a shuffling, or somebody is admonished in some way. And so it's really important to take account of that lived reality of all the people who are going to be involved in the evaluation process. But it's also sometimes something that community members, those who are actually served by the organization, will also see as threatening. And it's true, right? I mean, if a nonprofit is basically funded based on the extent to which it's meeting these targeted goals, then either there can be a decision made by the organization or by the entities that are funding the organization that based on the results of the evaluation, that program or service will no longer be provided. So those are real things, and they need to be taken into consideration and dealt with up front and on top of the table. In addition to that, there's also a history in psychology of research methods, particularly quantitative methods, being used for, how can we say, maybe suspect agendas, right? So you need not look no further than intelligence testing and eugenics and phrenology and these sorts of things to see how folks who had foregone conclusions about differences across races in intelligence were able to apply what at the time seemed to be really cutting edge research processes, but not to pursue some form of truth, but rather to advance a political agenda, which basically was meant to show racial superiority of white people. And so those things are real, and they shouldn't be minimized when we think about the quantitative aspects, or even for that matter the qualitative aspects. But I bring up the quantitative methods because there seems to be quite the emphasis nowadays from funding sources on quantitative. So for many, many years, right, it was okay to sort of have a portfolio of anecdotes or testimonials and put those out there as evidence that a program was working. And nowadays, little by little, it's getting away from that. I mean, it's not as if those things don't count at all. But more and more of the funding sources are saying, show me the so-called hard data on whether or not the program is working. So those are things that need to be taken seriously. In addition to that, our view is consistent with CREA also in the sense that we really are not looking at cultural deficit thinking. So cultural deficit thinking can be described as this idea that one group is experiencing a less than optimal outcome in a particular area, and that the reason for that less than optimal outcome lies within some kind of problem of the group itself. In this case, you can think about it as culture. So as an example, if you said, look at academic differences in achievement, right? Some would call those achievement gaps. Other folks would look at that and say, well, it's not so much that there's an achievement gap. I mean, that's sort of the unfortunate consequence of opportunity and reward gaps. Structural differences in terms of access to and quality of education across groups. Not only that, but also inconsistencies in the classroom in terms of pedagogy, in terms of content, in terms of standardized testing. All of these sorts of things come into play when you're thinking about what these differences in metric outcomes would be. So even the selection of which metrics matter is coming from a structuralized place. Right, and so when we address the evaluation process, our goal is not to identify what's wrong with a group of people that needs then the nonprofit to come in and uplift them from some kind of bad place. But it is, in fact, to look at more the bigger picture and to situate what's going on with the relationship between the nonprofit and those that are served by the nonprofit, to better understand, what that experience is like, really for both parties and the interaction of both parties. Now, a very important aspect of this, when you're thinking about the CREA perspective, is to involve the stakeholders throughout the process, right? So ideally, what would happen then when we do an evaluation, all the way from the beginning of thinking about who are the major stakeholders, who are the people for whom these results will have a significant impact. Those decisions should not only include maybe the board members of the organization or the evaluation team if they're external, but also the folks in the community who are being served as well, right? They should have a voice in terms of what the evaluation is supposed to be accomplishing, what methods seem to resonate with their collective view of reality and the experience with the nonprofit. So and then also going back, and we'll talk about this in the second video a little bit more, with member checking and ensuring that the interpretation of data makes sense to the people in the community, and then of course how the results of the evaluation will be used. So all the way throughout that process, ideally we would advocate for community members to be involved so that it has meaning to them and it minimizes the risk of exploitation. In addition to that, we would also pay attention to power dynamics, right? That's something that for me is very personal because of my experience in service learning. Since we're a university, we have something of a reputation, not St. Mary's specifically, but just as universities, higher education in general, of coming into settings and dictating how things are supposed to go. right? So we need you to control this and control that because it'll be bad for our research design if we introduce bias or error somewhere along the line. Our goal as CBR evaluators is not to come in and dictate things to the organization. Our goal is to come in and initiate those conversations so that we can all come to a place that makes sense for what the organizational goals are, which makes sense for what the community needs are and what their desires are. So we look at the university community organization relationship. We look at the organization to the people who ostensibly are being served, and of course, to complete the triangle, the university and the community members themselves. So power dynamics are something that we consider to be always already present in and need to be taken into consideration in the evaluation process. Another thing that's important is clarifying why the organization exists in the first place. We learned this through our work with the San Antonio Area Foundation. We would ask that question, and many organizations would say either their mission statement, which just seemed to be kind of like a rote memorization demonstration, or they would say to get grant money. But really, the grant money is something that allows for the services to be provided. But getting the grant money in and of itself at least shouldn't be why the organization exists, right? So it's important then to be able to think through what is the actual overall purpose of this community organization existing, and then start working on the evaluation from there. And then lastly, I would like to mention that the person as the instrument is also important to consider. And that's one of the reasons why, for us, the whole academic aspect and training students and building capacity is important. Because at the end of the day, all of the decisions that are being made come from a value place, and they come from a place of training. So to really be honest about how the evaluator factors into that process is a central point of what we do. When we work with nonprofits, by far the most common reason that they will mention for wanting to conduct an evaluation is for external funding. So either they want help in designing an evaluation because they're applying for a grant, or, which seems to be even more common, there's a need to report back to a funder for a grant that has already been received, the activities have already been completed, but evaluation is somewhat of an afterthought. Kind of like, oh my goodness, we owe this back to the funder, what do we do now? I think by and large organizations have improved on that, but still, we still get that. And really, evaluation should be more of a deliberate process, right? I mean, I don't even think that the nonprofits would disagree with that, but things happen, and so we need to go on from there. But in addition to external funding, another equally as good reason is for the continuous feedback, so that information can be gleaned from processes and outcomes through the evaluation process that can shed light on where things are going the way that they're intended and areas that might need to be addressed. Now again, that's not to say that evaluation should be seen as a weapon to be used against staff, or specifically as a cost-saving measure just to cut programs and to be able to rationalize that. But rather just to get good data about how programs and the activities within those programs are functioning. So given that, it's important then to consider right off the bat what the purpose of any particular evaluation is, so that it can meet the internal needs, right? And through that careful consideration, there should be a generative process that yields evaluable questions. So those are questions that the evaluation process can actually answer. It's sort of like if you were doing a research study, what your research questions would be, and then those would then yield your hypotheses. In a very similar way, when you're thinking about kind of the big picture questions that are able to be answered through the evaluation, from that then would stem the processes and ultimately even the metrics that would be used. In addition, though, we would say that you also need to ensure that no harm is being caused to the community members. As I had said previously, the evaluation process can be quite threatening. Again, to the internal staff, because it could be something where their positions are at least felt to be under duress, and then also for those for whom the community services are supposed to be provided, because are they going to lose something that they have come to count on and that matters to them? So to do that, and also from what we had mentioned before about cultural deficit thinking, that the folks who are using the services are not portrayed in a negative light, that they're respected, that they're shown dignity, or treated with dignity, and that their interests are prioritized. Now, ideally, what we're trying to do with the nonprofits, beyond simply providing skills and building knowledge with the staff, is to create a culture of evaluation. Because a lot of these things that we said before about the threats are a lot less likely to be problematic if evaluation is just part of the everyday process of what goes on at the organization, right? And so when the staff and when the community members and everyone else knows that this isn't something that seems to have come out of the blue, that's because when that happens, what goes on in the mind of the person that doesn't have control over the evaluation process is, so they're going to try to collect some data to justify some unfavorable action against me or against my program or what have you. But if it's there from the beginning, and if there's buy-in and a good, solid explanation as to why the evaluation is being done, it's easier to not only get less defensiveness out of the folks who are involved in the evaluation, but better quality data, which is pretty much at the top of what we're trying to accomplish through the evaluation. It's also important to consider kind of the difference, if we just want to get down to terminology, between an evaluation and an assessment. And the way that we use those terms, and it's not absolutely consistent throughout the literature, it's why there's some confusion. But when we use that term, we usually think about evaluation as being programs and processes that are evaluated, whereas people are more likely to be assessed. Now that doesn't necessarily mean, again, I want to really drive this point home, that if someone is being assessed, that's meant to be punitive or hostile. Simply assessing someone could be where you want to see whether a student in an after-school program is doing better at math as a function of having been in that program. That would be an assessment. The overall impact of the program would be part of the program evaluation. So as we go through the remainder of this video and the second video, we just want to make sure that terminology is common across us, that's the difference between evaluation and assessment. And then finally, on this section here, we're going to talk about isomorphic attributions. The term actually originally came from the social psychological literature, and what it means, right, is the same shape of an explanation. So if I were a community member, or I were a staff member, or I were somebody who were providing the data, would my explanation for what's going on match with the explanation that's coming out of the evaluation? Now that's not to say that you just give a blank sheet of paper and say, hey, you do the evaluation for me, but it does mean that there's a responsibility on the evaluator to make sure that those things are synchronous, that they flow together, and that those explanations are common across data sources. Another key aspect that we focus on quite a bit in our evaluations is what we refer to as mission to metric alignment. And basically what this means is that everything from the original mission statement through the instruments that are used to collect data should be aligned. And the reason that this is important is to avoid what is often referred to as mission drift. And so, a lot of organizations, and out of financial necessity, will look for grants and then say, how can we change what we're doing in order to make a case to get this money? And while it's understandable, the long-term impact of that can be quite negative, right? Because what happens is, one, the organization forgets what it is that they're doing. Like, why is it that we started to exist in the first place? And then there also becomes a lot of inefficiency because there's just like a scattershot of programs that aren't necessarily able to take an economy of scale approach to the resources. So the first thing that we usually do is to try to figure out if all those things are already in alignment. Once that's done, it's easier to then also consider the return on investment of particular programs and activities within those programs. So mapping all of that out, from the mission to how do the objectives manifest that mission, how do the programs feed into those objectives, that's usually one of the first steps that we do in the evaluation process after we've established the reasons for conducting the evaluation process in the first place. So yeah, and that usually takes some time, but we get really positive feedback for organizations that have kind of gone adrift over the course of time. Another important step is to construct what we call a stakeholder map. So basically, the way we do this is to take account of all of the folks who have a vested interest in this evaluation, and even more broadly in the program itself. All right, and so we've made a point, hopefully we've driven it home quite well, that the community members that are served by the nonprofit are in fact stakeholders, as well as the nonprofit itself and the funders, and some might say, in a more distal sense, the broader community, right? And so once we have the full complement of stakeholders listed, then we go through and try to list out what success would look like, right? So if in the ideal case, the program is operating at its peak performance, what would that look like to the various stakeholders? Because once we do that, then we can start thinking about the metrics, like how do we know that that success is already being achieved? The other thing too is to be able to classify the different types of stakeholders. And this keeps us sort of grounded in the bigger picture of power dynamics and how people are relating to that evaluation. So we classify them really in two different ways. One, which we kind of think of as somewhat unique to our Office of Community-Based Research, is authentic versus compulsory. And the authentic stakeholders are the ones that are most closely tied to the evaluation and really to the program itself. Whether the program has success or failure has real implications for these folks' lives. And so, as you can imagine, those might be folks for whom a box fan is really important, or a student for whom passing the state-mandated exam is important. These are the sorts of folks who would be the most authentic stakeholders to the program evaluation, and we would classify them as such. The compulsory stakeholders would be those who have to be sort of kept happy in order for the program to function. And so, as one might imagine, those would be mainly the funders and maybe city or government officials, but whoever it is that needs to believe that the program is doing good things in order for the program to continue to exist and to be able to provide those services. So we make a big point of distinguishing between the authentic and the compulsory stakeholders. Other places, and we will do this too, we'll talk more about primary, secondary, maybe even tertiary stakeholders. And some folks will define the primary as those who actually have the most influence over the program. Right, so if you think about working your way up the chain within a nonprofit organization, you might be able to identify who the primary stakeholders are. And then the secondary ones are the ones that are on the periphery a little bit more. We think that you could actually maybe do multiple classifications in order to arrive at a more comprehensive status for each stakeholder. But to us, the bigger issue is the authentic and the compulsory, and then how they would define success, because those things will then lead to the metrics. And after we cover a couple other things here in our logic model, we'll get back to those metrics very specifically. Perhaps the term that is most frequently nowadays associated with evaluation, other than maybe UG, would be logic model, right? Everybody is keyed into putting together a logic model. Funders are asking for, especially bigger, like your NSFs and Department of Education and these sorts of places, all asking for logic models. And it's not without reason. I mean, a logic model is part, we would argue not the entire part of the rationale for why someone is going to give you money, right? Because at some point you have to be able to say, this is what we're working with, this is how we intend on using the money to fund these activities are going to lead to these outputs and outcomes and so on. And really, you know, some might argue that a well-constructed logic model more or less writes a grant for itself. If you can follow the logic model, then all you have to do is wrap some text around it and you've got your grant. So yes, we would agree in large part with the importance of a logic model, but we think a little bit more highly of the theory of change, which is the topic that we'll cover next. But before we get to theory of change, we'll talk a little bit about like why the logic model plays such an important role. One of those reasons is because it tracks back to the objectives. As we mentioned earlier, when we map out through the dry erase board exercise what it is that the organization is trying to accomplish, we start with the mission, we work our way through the objectives, down to the programs, and within the programs, the activities, and then we can start to get an idea of the metrics. And we hope that all of that is in alignment. So the logic model captures then sort of, I mean, there's multiple ways you can do a logic model. I don't mean to suggest that there's only one, but what we typically use it for then is to say, okay, if this is the program, what are the activities within that program? And then once we've kind of isolated those, we can work on either side, right? We can talk about, so who are the people that are involved? And what are the resources that are involved, sort of inputs into those activities? And then as you follow from the activities, you think more about, okay, so what are the outputs? And how can we check the fidelity of the implementation of these activities? And then ultimately to look at the short-term and the long-term outcomes. And so that gets you into things like benchmarks and aspirational goals, and looking more broadly at the overall impact, some will even use that term in a logic model, on the broader community. Now, one of the problems, right, when you start getting into things as abstract as impact is measuring that. And it kind of bothers us a little bit that we're going to include things that we know ahead of time we're going to have difficulty measuring. So we might put it out there just for the sake of, again, situating a program within the larger organization and the organization within the larger mission and community context within which it exists. But we would acknowledge ahead of time that it would be very difficult to measure a lot of what people would put into a traditional logic model as impact. In addition to that, it really challenges you to think about some of the extraneous efforts. So what all then, when you're constructing your logic model, is going on with a program that isn't logically connected to the outputs and the outcomes that you're wanting to see? And again, just to emphasize, this isn't for the purposes of identifying and eliminating positions or people or resources necessarily. It's to understand, again, why things are and people are being dedicated to a particular activity, and then, of course, through the activity to a particular program. And so the logic model really helps think through that. So whereas the logic model tends to get a lot of attention in people's quest for evaluation, generally speaking, for us, the absolute most important component of the evaluation comes down to the theory of change. Now, it might be just because, we're coming from academia, and so we have this research mentality that influences how we think about evaluation. And that's possible. We don't mind owning that. But, I think if you're going to make a compelling case to an external entity that is wanting to fund your program, being able to explain why your activities are going to lead to the desired outcomes, just to us seems like an inescapable necessary condition, right? So, and even if it isn't for external purposes, if you simply want to get information back about what's going on with your program, you can't really understand how to change things unless you conceptualize it as a system. I think W. Edwards Deming might appreciate that. But also understand how that system works. And how that system works boils down to the theory of change. And so, this becomes quite contentious sometimes with us, because a lot of organizations really do mean well. And they have what might be thought of as pet theories that emanate from maybe a particular political orientation or sometimes a religious orientation, but are not grounded in the literature. And so they'll say, well, of course this will work because I really like this book that I read, or everyone knows that meritocracy and personal responsibility are the ways to go. So why do we need all of this tweed jacket research in order to show? And besides, look, aren't the folks who are being served by us doing better? The proof is in the pudding, so to speak. We don't need all of this very dry academic literature. The problem with that is that, it might work, and you might actually be contributing to the literature if you have a systematic way of showing that that's going on. And it's very uncommon for nonprofit organizations to want to do what they would consider the gold standard of like a randomized control design, right? So you're going to have a bunch of people who could benefit from the services that you're providing, but instead you're going to put them on a wait list randomly and then randomly assign others to get the services and then compare them. Nobody wants to do that. And so without that level of kind of an experimental design, then simply saying that people did better as a function of participating in the program, it can't really be shown with any sort of confidence, right? So I'll give you an example. Imagine that you had a program for first year college students, and you advertise it out there, and you get a bunch of folks who want to participate, and you say, we're taking all of them. And let's just say you got maybe 15% of your incoming class decided to do this, and the other 85 didn't. Okay, and then you say, look, the 15% outperformed the 85%. That just goes to show that our program works. Now, without ever even knowing what the program is, you might be tempted to say, yes, right? Look, 15%, 85%, these folks are the high achievers. But isn't it also likely that the folks who took the effort and showed the initiative to be in this program were fundamentally different from the beginning? And so without that randomized control, the next best thing is to at least be able to relate back to the literature and say the reason why we would expect these things to happen is because research has shown that when people with these characteristics are presented with these kinds of conditions, they tend to behave in these kinds of ways. And so for us, like, that is absolutely essential to the evaluation process, is making that clear. Not just to us, but to themselves and to anyone else that's counting on them, the community members, the external funders. And a reluctance to do that really, really does get in the way of the quality of the evaluation. It makes it very difficult to interpret the results in any sort of meaningful way. So the theory of change is essential. The next two parts that we emphasize are Gantt charts and evaluation calendars. The Gantt chart is a means by which to illustrate when different parts of the evaluation will take place. And so it helps, like we use them to keep ourselves on track. Who's in charge of what? When will it happen? When will those data be analyzed? When are the reports due? When are the next grant application periods due? So to be able to make that very visible is one of the most helpful things that we do for ourselves and that we recommend for the nonprofit organizations to do. And when those are shared from our office to the nonprofit organization, it definitely helps because everybody can kind of tell what's coming. There isn't that element of surprise, which, although I suppose might keep things interesting, is not particularly useful to the relationship between the evaluator and the community organization. There's also an evaluation calendar then, which shows when different aspects, critical big aspects of different parts of the evaluation take place across the calendar year, right? So you might have multiple programs, and so the Gantt chart relates to one program, one part of the evaluation, and then you have another program and another program. The whole evaluation that you're doing can then be committed to a calendar, and in that way you can start to build in that culture of evaluation that we have been really pitching. And with that level of transparency and with eliminating those elements of surprise, it becomes that much less stressful and reduces the likelihood that those involved will feel threatened or nervous or anxious. So the Gantt chart and the evaluation calendar are both great tools. Once you've completed the evaluation, it'll be important to really consider how you want to report your results. And for that, we would recommend going back to your stakeholder map, right? Because it could be that you communicate one way, not different results. It's not like you're going to, fabricate data or draw different conclusions per se, but you're going to want to tailor your report to the stakeholders that are internal, the stakeholders that are in the community, and potentially the stakeholders, the compulsory stakeholders that fund the program in the first place. And so in doing that, you might end up writing one report that's very thorough and very detail-oriented, particularly with respect to the methodology. In another scenario, you're going to want to think about how best to get that information across to community members who probably aren't all that interested in the nuts and bolts of the evaluation system that you have going. And then others where you might want to communicate to folks within your organization and really hone in on particular aspects that have been at question in previous discussions. Regardless, you still need to go back to that conceptual plan, go back to those available questions, go back to the stakeholder map, because those are the definitions of success for the members of those target audiences. And the purpose of the evaluation is to answer those valuable questions with data. So in thinking about crafting your report, whether it be through something like PowerPoint, whether it be something through a very comprehensive evaluation document, or whether it be just hitting the high points, considering your audience and considering what those stakeholders have defined as success, that's what should guide the report writing process. One other key thing to consider with the evaluation is how to budget for it. And this really is very important to us as educators of future evaluators. One of the motivations for us in creating the academic programs as certificates was so that folks who have majored in other things could learn how to do evaluation and then not necessarily become professional evaluators, but be able to contribute to nonprofit organizations through their ability to do evaluation. That being said, they shouldn't be completely taken for granted. We strongly advocate for recognizing the value of these evaluation skills within your organization. If you have to go to an external source, that can be very expensive. If you look at guidelines put out by like the Corporation for National Service or the National Science Foundation, I mean, you could be talking anywhere from a very low of 5% up to easily 15, some even said 25% of your total award from, say, a grant. So, you know, this is a very important part of funding decisions, is your ability to demonstrate that you've thought ahead of time about evaluation, that you've taken it seriously, that you have somebody competent in that role, and that they can carry out the evaluation in a way that will answer the key questions about the impact of your program. So to go to an outside evaluator will be expensive, but the internal evaluator should not be just simply taken for granted. So that's really our words of advice there. Consult the heuristics, and then acknowledge both your internal and your external evaluators fairly and justly. Now, one way to be able to save cost in the beginning is to make use of our Office of Community-Based Research. Presently, we are not charging a fee-for-service in the Community-Based Research Office, and I suppose I should probably timestamp that at October 1st of 2020. So I don't know how long this video will be relevant, and so I can't promise that we are never going to have a fee-for-service scenario, but that is something that we feel strongly about, is that we need to be able to make these kinds of services available to nonprofits, help them to build their capacity, help them to be able to keep the costs down even after, you know, we've decided to help other organizations, and the ones that we've been helping have decided that they can handle it on their own. Now, the expectations that you should have for us are that we will meet and try to get a better understanding of what it is that you do at your organization. In addition to that, we'll also try to figure out what role the evaluation will play for you in the most immediate case, as well as what the culture of evaluation is at your organization presently. Once all of that has been, you know, kind of identified and hashed out, we'll sometimes develop an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, to try to capture everything that needs to happen in the evaluation in terms of timelines and deliverables, if there is any sort of compensation, anything like that. And then all DSAs, data sharing agreements as well, to make sure that we don't have to go through the human subjects, because typically the project is yours and it's an evaluation, that we get de-identified data, all of those kinds of things can be worked out. And then, you know, we'll talk about the students and staff that will be working on the project, what role mine will be in a supervisory capacity, as well as the communication expectations that you should have with us. So all of that would be worked out. And you'll see here on the slide what our contact information is. Once the COVID pandemic has subsided, you'll be able to come in person to our office, but you can also reach us by telephone and by email, and very soon through our website. So take a look at the slide, keep that in a safe place, and we certainly hope that in the not too distant future we'll be able to help you with your evaluation and to help develop further capacity. So in conclusion, I'd like to just sort of do a recap of where we have come from overall across the two videos, really. If you were to go back to part one, we talked a little bit about the person side, the human side of doing evaluations, and I did some self-disclosure about myself and my background, credentials, interests, the pathway of getting here. We talked about the CBR office, who you can expect to be working with, students. It won't be the same students, hopefully, you know, for 5-10 years in a row, because they graduate. New folks will come in. We talked about CREA, and we talked about that's the cultural responsive evaluation and assessment, and how it drives what we do. It frames how we think, and it's not only who we respect, but who we feel responsible toward in terms of carrying out that work. We talked about the reasons for conducting evaluations in terms of giving yourself continuous feedback, getting external funding, and by the end, being able to generate new questions in an ongoing way so you can have that continuous feedback loop and be able to improve your processes. We talked about mission to metric alignment and what that means in terms of evaluation and how important that is to being able to not just get good data through the evaluation, but make sure that your organization as a whole stays on track for what you're trying to accomplish. We talked about types of stakeholders. We distinguish between authentic and compulsory, and we also distinguish between primary and secondary. Those are the folks for whom the evaluation matters, and without them, or without considering them, you can really go off track in terms of what the evaluation should be accomplishing. We talked about logic models and theory of change, and we really emphasized that although logic models get the most attention, that theory of change is really what the most critical point of this whole thing is. Why is it that you're doing what you're doing? Why would we expect the changes to occur that we're alleging will occur? Talked about Gantt charts, evaluation calendars, keeping you on track. In both the first and the second video, we talked about how to report outcomes and remembering the audience. We talked about budgeting, and then we talked about how to get assistance from the CBR office. In the second video, we talked about the qualitative and quantitative approaches, and how although they may seem different, and certainly people have different loyalties, in the end, they're all about explaining variance. They're all about capturing that snapshot in time. We went through various aspects of the qualitative research and the quantitative research. Talked about a whole host of statistical analyses that you could run and that we'd be willing to help you run. We talked about instrumentation. We talked about survey design. We talked about sample size and statistical power, as well as sampling strategies to try to get you enough people and a representative enough sample so that you can make inferences about your population from the folks from whom you've collected data. We talked about statistical software and the better choices and how to match those to what your needs are and what your cost allows. And then finally, we talked about getting all that information back in a usable format. So hopefully through these two videos, we've inspired you to think some more about evaluation and to leave knowing that we'll always be here to help you in the future. Come see us at the Office of Community-Based Research.